and welcome back to Drew's Automobile Wonders. It was a little over 30 years ago that one of the most famous body designs of all time, and what many would consider the best body designs of all time for GM, got put to rest. And thus came the end of an era for the legendary Squarebody. Now today in particular, I'm here to talk about the Squarebody Suburban, of which, not unlike its pickup truck siblings at the time, was also very useful and very utilitarian, as well as very versatile in what you could do with these. For example, if you wanted to haul family furniture around, you could do it. It had the room for it. Also, if you wanted to haul, say, your drag radials around for your hot rod or your drag car for a Saturday night at the drag strip, you can do it, as well as tow your hot rod or drag racing car. But what if I were to take one of these vintage carryalls and drop a 21st century drivetrain into one? Stay tuned. For nearly 2 decades, this body style remained virtually unchanged, except for a few minor interior upgrades and a few facelifts. Unlike the previous generations, it was also known for its roominess, both front and back. And with the help of these bench seats, you could easily carry the whole family across the country with a breeze. One of the most essential features on these vehicles was what you would find under the hood. Typically, you would find a 350 small block Chevy. Sometimes you would find a 305 Chevy under the hood. Sometimes on the earlier models, you would find a 250 inline 6. Sometimes you would find a 6.2 liter diesel. And in quite a few other cases, of course, you would find the legendary 454 big block. However, today, I'm here to prove to you that that can be changed for something much, much better. Here we finally are, including myself, as I've been waiting anxiously for months to finally post this video. Let's get down to it. This is going to be a video, finally, on my LY6 4L80 swap Squarebody Suburban. Now, when I got this thing, I traded my dually for it. And as you can see, it was a total donk. It had big 22-inch wheels on it, airbrushed flame job, and the interior was all hacked up with sound systems and aftermarket car alarms. And you're probably wondering, why would Andrew get a donk and trade for his 1989 Chevy 3500 dually that he had? Well, here's your answer right here. As you can see, it was virtually rust-free. Just minor superficial stuff. So as soon as I got it, actually about a month or so after I got it, I ended up getting it undercoated by Z-Bart as well as fluid filmed. And it was totally worth it to me. And for the drivetrain, you had a throttle body fuel injected Chevy 350, mated to a 700 R4 transmission that made a whopping 200-ish horsepower from the factory, closer to 180 at this point. And thanks to the aftermarket car alarms in it and the sound systems and stuff, they managed to hack into the engine harness. And with the fact that I didn't want to deal with 30-year-old barbaric OBD1 technology and having the fine wiring and stuff like that, I decided to go upon my decision at that point to just LS swap it. And likewise, as you can see here, all the wiring under the dash was pretty much a bunch of mashed up spaghetti. And it took about a day to cut out and pull out all the excessive wiring things that was integrated by the aftermarket car alarm as well as the sound systems that they attempted to put in this vehicle. As you can see, I pulled out tons and tons of wiring and speakers and all sorts of nonsense that I really didn't want in this thing anymore. And then ultimately, I would end up disfiguring the engine harness and then begin my process of pulling the engine out. After pulling the drivetrain out, I managed to make my way up to Freeman's Auto Salvage up in Davidson, Michigan. And that is where I was told there would be a 6-liter as well as a transmission available for me. But to my surprise, in spite of expecting a 4L60 mated to either a LQ4 or an LQ9, I would discover that it would be an LY6 mated to a 4L80. So I then packed it up for $1,000 for both the engine and trans pulled for me into my Fall Guy truck and proceeded to haul it back to Metro Detroit, where I would unload it right there in the driveway, awaiting to be torn down. So once I would get it in the garage, likewise, I would end up beginning to tear it down. And as I began to undress it and tear it into it, I discovered how relatively clean it was for having 150,000 miles, which is not a whole lot of miles for these engines in the first place. The biggest reason to get the LY6 was for these very cylinder heads, which are the 823s. Any LS guy would know that these LS heads are very good. So while I was tearing into this engine, I would begin also ordering the parts that I needed, including a VVT delete kit, lifters, lifter trays, as well as better valve springs and gaskets in order to put it all back together correctly. But the biggest thing I would get for this engine, knowing that I cannot leave anything alone performance-wise, was the 1840p, or as popularly called, the Sloppy Stage 2 camshaft. And of course, I would then at that point begin reassembly. And in the midst of it, as you can see here, I began also cleaning up the engine, including the deck and the piston tops. Followed by, of course, installing the valve springs into the cylinder heads. And then, of course, I would begin mounting the cylinder heads back on the block. I would then begin painting everything accordingly. I used header paint for the cylinder heads, and then I would use engine paint for the block, of course. And alongside that, I would also have a good friend of mine do the ripple paint job on the valve covers as well as the striping, which turned out relatively pretty good. And while the engine was out, I would then begin installing things like a new oil cooler, as well as the starter and some other hardware that's hard to get to while in the vehicle. I would also pick up headers from Speed Engineering for $300, all stainless. So then, the time finally came to put the engine and trans in the Suburban. I would then begin the slow process of hooking everything up, plugging everything in, and making sure everything is correct. However, I would run into a few snags. Like, for example, I would go ahead and install this beautiful Mazir water pump. However, as you'll see here in the coming minutes of this video, that this water pump ultimately would not work, and I would have to put a mechanical water pump back on it. But I would continue to gradually dress the motor up until I came across that issue. After setting the motor in place, I would discover that the transmission would need an aftermarket mount, so I ended up getting one off Summit Racing, relatively cheap, and it worked. All I had to do was drill holes in the frame. And here is where things would ultimately take a turn for the bad on this project with the route that I chose to go down. I would end up getting this aftermarket PSI harness custom ordered offline, as well as the drive-by-wire electronic pedal that I would also need for the drive-by-wire throttle body. Now, another big thing I would get would be this adapter kit from Holley for the old school R12 radial compressor for the air conditioning. But unfortunately, with this setup, we would not be able to use the Mazir electric water pump. Thus came the idea that I would have to go back to a mechanical one. However, going back to it was not that big of a deal. I was able to sell the Mazir water pump back and get 3/4 of my money back at least, or enough to at least put into more of the stuff that I needed along the way here. I would also end up getting electric fans as well as a radiator out of a 3/4 ton pickup truck that offered both transmission cooler and oil cooler hookups. Meanwhile, I would then begin installing the mechanical water pump and measuring for a proper size belt, of which I was fortunate enough to score at O'Reilly's that same day, so I didn't have to do much hunting. Then I would end up putting the front end back on finally, as well as hook the power steering lines up, which would fit directly to the pump on the LS, which is a glory thing about these engines, and working with factory older GM stuff. We would also begin installing things such as the radiator, as well as the fans, which required very minimum modifications to put back in the vehicle. And I was happy to look back and see that the engine bay was beginning to look like an engine bay again. I would then end up installing the oil lines as well as the transmission cooler lines. The mounting itself was pretty simple, as I would just end up flipping the stock radiator shackles around. After we installed the radiator, we then decided to put the hood back on as well. And then we went back underneath to begin routing the fuel line as well as the pump. Now for a pump, I ran a 60 psi Walbro fuel pump in line with the factory filter. And from the fuel pump to the engine was all aftermarket braided line. And then from the filter to the tank was all factory line still. Back under the hood, I began routing the coolant hoses, which were of factory spec for a Silverado 3/4 ton. I would then begin installing the smaller steam lines as well as the air conditioning system. I would also have to replace the transpan as well as the transmission filter due to having a huge dent in the bottom of it, and I just didn't want to take the chance of having any failures with the transmission due to being starved of fluid due to the big dent in the pan. So I went ahead and replaced the pan as well as the filter. I would install a Amazon special cold air intake, which is pretty cheesy, but it works. And then the time had finally come to begin rewiring everything to work. And as you can see here, we got the lights working. It was one of the first things we got working. While we were wiring, we also decided to put coolant in it, and had a unique way of putting it in, as my dad actually taught me this. It was vacuum filled, which actually is a whole lot better to fill than the conventional way, as it fills pretty much every single crevice with coolant that would normally see air pockets. And so after we got all the essential things to get it running wired up, we then began to experience serious troubles at this point. At this point, we would spend an entire summer trying to diagnose why the injectors were not pulsating. And after months of trial and error, including changing out the injectors, we would then finally discover that the ECU was junk and that the PSI harness was doing no good for us. And at the cost of a new ECU, as well as a new flash for the ECU to work with this configuration, we would conclude that it would be better off to eat the cost of that new aftermarket harness from PSI and just go with a Holley Terminator X system, which we discovered we should have done in the first place. And of course, installation for the Holley harness was a breeze. I would end up removing all of the PSI harness at this point and begin running all the Holley harness. And of course, it was very simple compared to having to fight the PSI harness. Alongside that, we would also attempt to use a low-car trans adapter, but would end up ultimately going back to using the stock column shift rod and extending it in order to make it work, as the cable system was not compatible with this particular steering column for this model year. I would then mock up a temporary exhaust system just to use for the time being until we got it running enough to where we could have the time to quiet it down. And then, of course, we would end up mounting it up, and it worked out pretty decently. And then, once everything was mounted up and wired up correctly, lo and behold, now, of course, with running, we also had to get it moving. But once we got it moving, we then drove it around some. And then after that, we figured that it was time to make it a little bit quieter. But not before I ended up doing a pull on the freeway, of which you first saw in this video. Now, with this Holley ECU, this is supposed to be a very self-learning, easygoing setup to learn how to tune and get correct. Meanwhile, it runs, and as you drive it around, it self-learns. So after doing enough of that, I finally decided that it was time to weld up a quieter exhaust, of which was also, at the time, proposed to be temporary, but I would end up liking it, as it was very, very quiet, as you'll hear in this next video. So with my liking to how this exhaust is, I decided to keep it for now. And with that, I decided to paint the exhaust tip white to give it an old school stock car looking appearance with the side exit. Now, of course, we are not done with this project yet, in a sense. We still got some bugs to work out. We've got stalling issues with it going in gear, as well as coming to immediate stops or moderate stops. We project that it is a vacuum issue that we got to get sorted out on the intake manifold. And meanwhile, we got other little bugs like the pulley setup. The belt is squealing on one of the pulleys, which we got to get a spacer and fix the pulley and get it to where it is set right with the belt. Otherwise, it is an annoying, squealing thing, and I can't stand it. So, with that all said, stay tuned. Lots more to come on this project. This is, I guess, technically a part 1 to this. So, feel free to like and subscribe, and you'll see plenty more of it. Meanwhile, take care, everybody.